It is a pleasure to welcome you here this morning for this symposium and also to announce the development of our Institute for Policing and Society at UC Irvine. So I want to start on behalf of the Schools of Law and Social Ecology and all of the event organizers and volunteers and supporters of this event. I want to start by welcoming you to what I think is a very important symposium on race and policing, and thanking you for your participation today. I want to make some brief remarks on why I see this as an important gathering and why I see the Institute as an important initiative in this very difficult time. I see our gatherings as important, if incomplete, acts of democratic deliberation, and these dialogues being vital to the articulation, the discussion of, the building of, and ultimately the maintaining of the society we want for ourselves and for generations to come. In our case, the immediate question being the racial politics of policing and social control more generally, and ultimately pathways to a realization of what I will call racial justice. These are indeed trying times we are in today, but they are not new. Contradictions of our democratic proclamations, our supposed rule of law, our vaunted freedoms have routinely been drawn into painful, sharp relief by racial violence perpetrated under the color of law, by civil and criminal impunity enjoyed by perpetrators, by the aiding and abetting of legislators and executives, and by the indifference, the endorsement, and often the active involvement of much of the American population throughout our entire history as a nation. Besides the spectacular violence we see from police and vigilantes over this period of time, criminalization, incarceration, deportation have played out over centuries, exacting a cultural, economic, and political toll on the nation as a whole, but whose harms have been concentrated and conveyed among generations of Native American, Black, Latino, Asian, and Pacific Islander populations. Now, I'm hopeful that we are, thanks to critical analysis and political mobilization over the past decade and more, that we've arrived at a point of reckoning in our society, a kind of fork in the road of our national story where the plot just might turn in the direction of racial justice, or so I want to believe this is the case. I also want to say, though, that we have been here before and we have failed to make that turn. Our nation was at a very similar fork in the late 1800s during Reconstruction, when several of my own African-American ancestors lived in Wilmington, North Carolina, a place that was for a moment regarded as the most progressive southern city in the post-emancipation period, owing to its racially integrated neighborhoods and its remarkable levels of economic and political equality. My ancestors owned their own businesses and considerable property in Wilmington. They held public office. They were in the state legislature, they were in municipal government, some of them were even law enforcement officers, black law enforcement officers in the late 1800s in Wilmington. That experiment in racial democracy ended violently in 1898 when white racial resentment, not unlike what we are seeing today, fueled a racial massacre and coup, killing or banishing prominent black Republicans and their white liberal allies. The city's representative government was dissolved. The leader of the coup became mayor, and many of the paramilitaries, the red shirts who had carried out the bloody massacre, were sworn in as police officers. Their reign of terror then continuing under the color of law. So this once most progressive southern city, at what seemed to be a promising turning point in this nation's history, was then rebranded the capital of white supremacy, inspiring a violent reign of Jim Crow that endured for over a half century. We reached another fork in the road during and after World War II, where the fight against fascism abroad brought a critical light to America's own racial tyranny. The Double V campaign of black soldiers demanding victory abroad and at home envisioned a democratic transition that again was not to come, including in policing and other legal institutions. Many city police forces only began then to include non-white officers in the aftermath of the war, many of them war veterans. But as the recent novel Darktown richly conveys, they were incorporated in ways that reinforced the violence of the white supremacist political system that has long defined our country. Freedom movements of the middle 20th century again drew scrutiny to racist police violence, generally under democratic policing, and there were familiar calls to end police occupation of poor communities, to dismantle the police state, and to generally increase democratic accountability. Despite important legal gains, these were soon overshadowed by racialized wars on crime and drugs, with police mobilized largely to combat urban youth of color. As a high school student in Los Angeles in the late 1980s, 100 years after my ancestors in Wilmington were subject to the onslaught of racial violence in Wilmington, I grew used to the harassment and threats of police and sheriff authorities who routinely used a pretext of gang investigation to train their guns on my friends and I, to physically and verbally abuse us, and to deprive us of constitutional rights that no one seemed to take serious. If the past is prelude, the prospects for truly transformative change look dim still today. We're in a unique historical moment, however, with new strategies and resources that I think have the potential to make some difference. Technological and other changes have created new forms of political capital, fueled new alliances, applied new pressures which simply did not exist in the periods I've just mentioned. There are also new ideas, including growing and compelling calls for a society without police or prisons, born of the recognition that police often violently escalate situations and that prisons and policing very rarely solve the problems that they are set out to resolve. Assuming there will be a continued police presence, however, at least for some transitional period, what will we demand of police organizations and authorities, and how will we work together to achieve that? This is why I think these gatherings are important, why this institute is important, because that's the work we have before us. There are plenty of ideas, including calls to rein in the more than 15,000 police forces with more federal and civilian oversight, to incentivize greater police exercise of care by increasing their civil and criminal culpability, and to address directly the complex cognitive processes contributing to racialized police violence. There's also renewed demand for democratic policing, the absence of which is, again, something we have seemingly grown used to. As the director of NYU's policing project recently noted, of all the agencies of executive government, those that police, that employ, force, and engage in surveillance are the most threatening to the liberties of the American people, and yet they are the least regulated by the two core requisites of American constitutionalism: democratic accountability and the adherence to the rule of law. When we take the backward and forward-looking approach to transitional justice, it clearly will not be enough to reform police organizations or to improve the training and accountability of individual officers, as challenging and as important as that is. We face a larger challenge of developing a political culture in this country actively committed to racial justice and opposed to racial violence, exploitation, and exclusion. We have faced that challenge since our inception as a nation and seen cycles with advances, retrenchments, and setbacks. As we gather here today and as we envision the Institute developing on this campus, movements for progress and retrenchment are at odds with each other all around us. Finally, as Ida B. Wells stressed in her crusade against lynching, quote, "The only way to right a wrong is to shine the light of truth upon it. Delusions and falsehoods are obstacles to transformative change." And just the other day, I was at a bar in New York City when, after asking about what I do for a living, a retired white executive, who I'm also going to mention was gay, turned to me and asked, quote, "Is there really bias in the criminal justice system?" Lest we believe that it's just the lay public who is either naive or invested in what Charles Mills brilliantly calls the epistemological dimension of the racial contract, the agreement to routinely misrepresent reality. The Democratic presidential candidate surprised me with her claim in the recent debate that we must, quote, "restore the trust between police and black communities," as if that trust was ever widespread in our nation's history, and she too was going to make America great again. President Obama has also perpetuated the illusion, declaring that just last year that, quote, our systems for maintaining the peace and our criminal justice systems generally work, except for this large swath of the population that is incarcerated at rates that are unprecedented in world history. An incredible and telling exception to the claim that all is well, and the kind of falsehood that prevents, I think, a transformation of political culture we can only achieve through truth-telling and by building new norms and institutions on the foundations of those truths. That time may be coming, and these deliberations, the institute we envision at UC Irvine should help to facilitate reshaping our long-divided nation into a more perfect union and trying to hold that together. So again, I want to welcome you and thank you and the organizers for your participation in this important work. And I want to introduce now my colleague Wes Scogan from Northwestern University's Institute for Policy Research to make additional opening remarks.
Do I have this high enough? Is this working? Okay, good. Thanks for having me. It's great to see so many familiar faces and hear and see familiar name tags. It's going to be a terrific conference. When Carol Surin called me, she asked me to give a giant background preview of everything lying behind all the issues that are going to be raised in the conference today and tomorrow. And I said, great. I said, that's the morning. Well, what are we going to do in the afternoon? And she said, you've got 20 minutes. So instead of being a tour de force through everything, this will be some general comments about some of the topics that are going to be raised by some of the people who are here. And because there's a lot of people here in the audience who are perhaps new to many of these topics, I'm going to try to make it interesting to them by digging deeper into the background of many of the contemporary issues. Although I promise at the end I'll get to those. The sad history of race in this country is intimately associated with the sad history of policing. The two have gone together really from the beginning of the modern police. We date the modern police in this country from about 1830 to 1840 to 1850, when American police departments in municipalities started to develop. In the South, the police conducted slave patrols. They were very much part of the social control system that kept slavery in place. Their job was to deal with runaways who might take off for the cities to maintain control, to keep blacks away from alcohol and firearms, the two things that slave owners were really most worried about, and to respond when slaves got out of hand. So police in the southern cities were very much part of the state control apparatus of slavery. In the North, police had responsibilities for slave catching. Because of fugitive slave laws, in many states, they were responsible for apprehending and sending back runaways. This is why the ultimate goal of many slaves trying to escape the South was to get to Canada, because they could avoid the slave catchers, the police in the northern cities. There weren't many African Americans in the North at these times, but there was plenty of legislation passed in the northern states forbidding racial intermarriage. Segregation of public facilities. The Supreme Court said that was great, and states did it all over the North. Restrictions on owning real estate or engaging in contracts. What we came to think of as Jim Crow laws in the South, that is, laws on the books radically constraining the lives of African Americans. Those laws were actually born in the North. In the South, they were slaves. In the North, they were laws. And Jim Crow didn't move south until later. That came after the Civil War, when Jim Crow laws and what were known as black codes were developed. Black codes constraining the opportunities for the newly enfranchised citizens in the South in employment, property ownership. Tough laws against being idle or vagrant, for example, were developed at this time. It loosened up a little bit during Reconstruction when the Union Army occupied the South, starting in 1867. They were there for 11 years, but when they left, then the South descended into kind of a long, dark period in American history. Jim Crow laws moved from the North to the South, and the combination of the Klan, white mobs, and the police were in charge of the political system. Why do I focus on the South? Because that's where all the African Americans were. At this time, the black population outside the South is extremely tiny. So policing and social control of African Americans in our history is a Southern phenomenon all through the 19th century. Now, policing itself began to change as we moved toward the 20th century, the early 20th century. Before the emergence of the Progressive Era, say in the 1920s or maybe right around World War I would characterize American policing back before then as being lazy, corrupt, and brutal, with perhaps the laziness being the only saving feature of many big city American police departments. They were intimately linked to corrupt political machines, and the politics of the time, the politics of the 20s was really feisty and interesting. There was this vast big city corruption in the political machines. There was huge immigration of swarthy Catholics from Southern Europe who were challenging the Protestant control of cities and states. There were fights over demon rum and prohibition. And the progressives wanted to remove the police from all that. So they began a process which came to its height really at the end of the 1940s, which was to make the police much more autonomous from the political system, much more autonomous from the economic system. There were civil service protections for the first time in this progressive era. In the 1900s, here was the drill in Chicago. After every election, all police officers were fired. The entire police force was fired and then was selectively rehired by the new administration that came in. The same thing was true in schools. All school teachers were fired, and then they were selectively rehired. You had to choose your political factions very carefully at the end of the 19th century in Chicago because your livelihood depended upon it. Teachers were able to grasp the protections of professionalism much more effectively than the police, so they escaped this system by the end of the 1890s. But right into the 20th century, Chicago police held their jobs totally at the whim of ward politicians and people in City Hall. So civil service protections putting a halt to this kind of political intervention in hiring and staffing, educational qualifications, a background screening, and better pay for police officers, which you had to do to support the kinds of people that they were trying to hire beginning in the Progressive Era. And now we're starting to enter the modern era, because with World War I comes the first of the great migrations. There's great migrations to the jobs in the north. African Americans come by the millions up the Illinois Central Railroad and other avenues from Mississippi and Alabama in the south. The second big migrations are in the 1930s when Southern agriculture collapsed under the boll weevil and jobs disappeared because of mechanization. And then the final great migration with the jobs and opportunities created in the north by World War II. So that African Americans moved north, both push and pull, pulled by jobs, pulled by opportunity, pulled by the absence of Jim Crow laws, pushed by policing, among other things, and by the rough life of Southern sharecropping. Whereas African Americans were originally a Southern and rural folk, by the 1950s they became a Northern and urban folk. It was a dramatic shift in the demography of African Americans in this country that reshaped everything about our society and everything about our politics. As they came north, the northern cities at that time were full. Chicago had more than 1 million more people than they have today living in the city's boundaries. There wasn't much space, there wasn't much elbow room. The competition over housing, the competition over jobs was intense. And political conflict within the cities was endemic. African Americans moving to the north faced lots of problems, some of which you would find hard to recognize today. One problem was being ignored. Busy Friday and Saturday nights, the police department simply stopped sending cars to black neighborhoods, for example. So that actually not enough police protection was one of the big problems that they faced. And of course, they were totally invisible to the media. So to the extent to which the media impact politics and policy, which is huge, they played no part in public discussions about crime and policing. So this takes us to the early 1960s, where what we've got is a very large, very young, very poor, very isolated African American population in cities, shut out from civil and economic life, stewing in these very crowded conditions Many African Americans in Chicago in 1960 living in buildings that were built in the 19th century, still with toilet facilities at the end of the hall and not associated with each dwelling unit. And when you add to that situation at the end of the 1950s, abrasive contacts between the police and the public, what you had was a recipe for the riots of the middle of the 1960s. And there were 2 rounds of riots. Right about in the middle of the 1960s, and again at the end of the 1960s. More than 100 American cities went up in flames. It was a dramatic moment in our history. Old guys like me can remember helicopter shots on television of circling above the Capitol building, which was surrounded by the 101st Airborne, which had set up a perimeter of sandbags and machine guns to protect the Capitol building. There was another airborne division that was protecting the White House. In Chicago, the streets were patrolled by the National Guard in armored personnel carriers, and that was the scene in many American cities through several waves of the riots of the 1960s. When the Kerner Commission was established to investigate the situation, they went rogue, and they actually produced a report which was important, interesting, detailed, and named names and places. And one of their memorable findings was in tracking the origins of every one of those disorders. Every one of them had an origin in a bad contact between the police and the public, a bad stop, a police shooting, a black child run over by a squad car as it was speeding through a neighborhood, an accident. But these kinds of problems were the immediate spark behind every one of these riots. So at the end of the 1960s, what we had was a society where white flight had now become a white tumult. Whites were pouring out of American cities. Left behind was a cynical population that didn't trust the man. The man was the police, and the police were unresponsive and uninterested in them. Not just the police, but the entire apparatus of government was seen as not the solution to any problems, but the source of problems. And then, starting in 1962, was this huge increase in crime. And there was a huge increase in urban crime, and the huge increase was in African-American neighborhoods. The homicide rate went up by 450% by 1962 and 1974. A big fix for all the very interesting and important big fix begins to emerge out of police thinking in the middle of the 1980s. And that big fix was going to be community policing. Community policing was and actually is a very important concept. During the 1980s and the 1990s, it was the sort of the organizing paradigm of law enforcement in this country, and it still affects us today. It still affects how police chiefs talk about what it is they're trying to do, and it still affects how politicians talk. The community policing had lots of strategic elements. I spent 10 years of my life simply studying community policing. It was decentralization. It was finding ways to listen to the neighborhoods, to identify local problems and priorities. It was problem solving. Police would take on disorder, and they would take on neighborhood physical decay in addition to crime, so it was an expansion of the police mandate. There were mechanisms for community input and responsiveness to community input. Community policing was wildly popular, and by the end of the 1990s, there was no police chief in America who didn't have a program that they could point to that was going to fix their relationship with the public because it was community policing. No police chief could be without a community policing program. Well, you could sort of rest on your laurels for a while, but in the winter of 2015, I was asked to testify before President Obama's commission. And they asked me to talk about where is community policing today. So I spent some time cruising websites, clicking into city sites, reading reports, reading newspapers. And when I testified before the commission in February of 2015, I pronounced it virtually dead. Community policing died, in my analysis, for really 3 big reasons. One was, and most importantly, was cities went bust. They went bust in the middle, in that 2008, but especially 2009, 2010 period, when the tax collections started not to flow in as they had in the past because of the Great Recession. And as police departments retreated to what they like to call their core activities, community policing was among the first victims. So programs were closed and units were disbanded and civilian employees were laid off as part of this retrenchment. A study by the Police Foundation found that 3/4 of all American cities cut their budgets during this period, and police departments everywhere found it difficult to fill vacancies they were downsizing by attrition. So the economics was an important part of it. The cities went bust and community policing was seen as not the core function. There were also competing priorities in the 2000s. Those two competing priorities pushed hard by Washington were terrorism policing and immigration enforcement. And the thing about both of those is that the actions that police take are antithetical to the community policing model. They involve investigations, they involve surveillance, they involve stopping and searching, they involve aggressive street sweeping, all the things that police chiefs had tried to get away from in building their relationship with the community. And the Bush administration in particular pushed hard on American cities to get involved in immigration enforcement, to start using their contacts in the community to roust out illegals and drive them back south of the border. Most police chiefs I know resisted stoutly this, but others drank the Kool-Aid. And so this was a set of competing priorities that worked in the opposite direction of community policing. And then finally, frankly, lots of other new ideas in policing came into the agenda space. I made a list of the sort of hot topics of policing in the 2000s. Predictive policing, intelligence-oriented policing, metrics-driven policing, evidence-based policing, procedural justice policing, hotspot policing. You could pick your innovation if you were a police chief wanting to get ahead. You could get invited to the White House by doing all kinds of these things. You didn't necessarily have to do the hard stuff of community policing anymore. There were grants. You could find yourself a chief job by pursuing these other hot new ideas in policing. So community policing was no longer basically the sole reform paradigm by the time we got to the 2000s. Now there's still support out there. Politicians and police chiefs will deny that they've stopped doing community policing. In their websites, they always say, well, we disbanded it and we closed and we laid off, but that's because everybody does it. It's no longer anything special. It's our department's core mission. So the rhetoric is still there, and there's still a surprising amount of support. I recently completed a survey of 16,000 American police officers in, I wrote it down, 84 cities. And what we found when you look at the aggregate up to the 84 sample cities, that in 70% of these cities, the officers we surveyed reported to us in the survey that their chiefs were still pushing community policing. They were still pushing that as a priority. They were still talking about it to the troops. So it's actually still alive out there at the management level, in part because they think it's so politically popular. And the officers themselves, more than 75% of the 16,000 people, thought it was kind of a good idea. I was reminded that it's been around so long that they all grew up under it. They were all recruited since community policing became part of the rhetoric of policing. So there's that reservoir of support, there's that reservoir of ideas, there's that infrastructure that's still kind of there. And as we get to the contemporary scene, which is the legitimacy crisis that I'm about to describe to you, we may decide that community policing is a response to that legitimacy crisis. And if we do, I think that the possibilities for blowing new life into community policing are really still there. Now, this is not the best of times in policing today. It's also not the worst of times. A lot of problems have gotten fixed. The police are much more effective in crime fighting than they were back in the corrupt and lazy days, or even in the reform period of the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. Patrick Murphy, who was a chief of police in New York City, once described it. He said, "Wes," he said, "you've never heard a better sociologist than a precinct commander whose crime rate is going up." But what police have done is they've taken ownership. They can no longer become sociologists when things are running the wrong way. They've got to own it, and that's probably a good thing. They become more effective at dealing with it, and they've taken responsibility for it, and we can hold them responsible. They certainly have become much less corrupt. Money corruption is vastly less of a problem than it was even in the 1960s and the 1970s. They're better equipped. There's much more equitable resource evaluation. That problem of not being able to get a car because they're just too busy to send them to black neighborhoods. Political scientists, when it was fashionable to do urban service delivery studies, reported that the police were actually the most efficient, the most effective in terms of translating need into actual resource allocation. That is, it's very professionally driven, very algorithm driven, very data driven. Police departments are the original home of big data. And finally, police leaders in particular are vastly much more sophisticated and much more professional about what it is that they're up to. So why are we here, despite all this good news? And we're here because of the legitimacy crisis that's been created by the current constellation of American society and American policing. That they've come together in ways that challenge the fundamental legitimacy of police and even of the political system. Now, legitimacy is the cornerstone of democracy. Without legitimacy, you have Germany in 1937. Without legitimacy, you can't have democracy. Legitimacy underlies cooperation with the police. Legitimacy underlies crime reporting. Legitimacy even affects people's offending. Delinquency, in particular, is affected by what people think about the state and about the legitimacy of the police. And that legitimacy crisis has come upon us because of the confluence of conditions and events that have occurred in this country. The underlying condition was the urban predicament, and that's not new, that's been with us for some time, which is the combination of guns, gangs, and violent crime. And that syndrome of guns, gangs, and violent crime, which is incredibly concentrated in a few places in this country, because in most of this country, crime is down hugely. It's been an immense decline. So we're talking about a relatively small number of places where this confluence of guns and gangs and violent crime has become concentrated in our society. It's not affecting everybody anymore, only some people. Then you add to that mix episodes of police misconduct. There's nothing new about that either, but it mixes into this brew of guns and gangs and violence in ways that are potentially very explosive. Last year in Britain, the police shot nobody. 65 million people in Britain. The year before, they shot one person. He had a hostage and had a knife at the throat of his hostage. So the difference between here and Britain is that when police respond, they don't assume that everybody's armed. When they see something dark in somebody's hand, they assume it's a cell phone. It's the guns part of the equation are a central part of this urban predicament that we find ourselves in. And then what happens right now here in the second decade of the 2000s is an immense increase in inequality, making conditions even worse in these places. The high level of media attention focused on these issues, plus the emergence of video and social media, which has lent credibility, veracity, and documentation to complaints that were routine and real for the entire life of American policing, but now become something alive on the internet and play a quite different role in the political process. Just some observations about the depths of this legitimacy crisis. The Pew Research Institute just put out the results of a new national poll looking at black and white differences in opinion about important things in policing. And the differences that the poll reveals are really, really stark. So they asked people to rate police on their effectiveness at protecting people from crime, using appropriate force when need be, treating racial groups equally, and holding officers accountable. And as you can guess, African American respondents to this national poll were way, way down there near the bottom of the ocean. Whereas most white respondents, who live mostly in places where there's not much crime and where all this is just in the media, said no problem whatsoever. The gaps were enormous between blacks and African Americans. Very interesting that Pew asked whether fatal encounters between police and African Americans are an isolated incident or signs of a broader problem. 80% of African Americans said it was a sign of a broader problem. Less than half of whites think it's a sign of a broader problem. So they have a very different kind of analysis of the condition that they're in as well. Now, white opinion is somewhat responsive to events. After the Rodney King episode, for example, there was a very substantial shift in both black and white opinion. about the police that endured for almost 15 years. I tracked those opinion polls. You may remember Rodney King. That was the first of these video presentations of what was happening out on the street. 95% of Americans said they saw the tape. That's more than know the name of the president. So that's a very high level of recognition. And as I said, there was for 15 years, you could see, even in white opinion, the shift that took place before and after Rodney King. What Gallup and Pew now find is that the novelty value of this has gone away. So most recently, Gallup had done a poll just before the shootings in St. Paul and the shootings of police officers in Dallas. And what they found after the St. Paul and Dallas shootings was a big increase in the percentage of respondents, even white respondents, who thought that race relations was America's biggest problem. But the next poll they did, whites had dropped back down to where they were before. Only African Americans stayed in an elevated condition as a result of these kinds of things. So that the gap is not being much affected by events anymore. Certainly not in the way that it was in the past, when the novelty value of this kind of evidence was new. So I think that our crisis today is a crisis of legitimacy. It's not a crisis about policing. There are many fine things about the way in which American policing has evolved, but it's very specifically African Americans in big cities legitimacy crisis, and figuring out how to fix the underlying causes of the crisis and respond in some direct way to the legitimacy problem that it spawned, it seems to me, should be our agenda for the day. You're going to hear during this conference lots of discussions, for example, of police stops, stop and frisk, searches. These are exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about these immediate drivers of the legitimacy crisis that we have today. Thank you very much.